Ex-prisoners, who was the most evil person there, and what did they do that was so bad? Story 1. There was this dude in his 40s, this was when I was at the county jail, before being shipped off to state prison, who was a janitor at an elementary school. He was weird, with a giant Star of David tattoo on his back and blonde highlights in his longish, bowl-cut black hair. He sodomized 2 girls, 9 and 11, with a broom handle. I think his charge was sodomy with a foreign object. I remember everyone feeling contempt because we knew that in that county, child offenders got off easy. Fortunately, we were wrong. He was given life. I remember the paper he got from court read, "Release date, deceased." There was another chomo who forced himself on his 3-year-old daughter, and when his wife caught him, she freaked out and called the police. He ran from the cops in a car and drove off a cliffside. Whether that was on purpose or not, I'm not sure. But here's where it gets worse. So after the accident, he couldn't talk or act normal. He was essentially retarded, would shuffle around and rock back and forth anytime someone talked to him. Brain damage is what people said from the car crash. People were nice to him until they found out his charge, then ignored him or were cold towards him. But he was retarded at this point, so no one went out of their way to harm him. This went on for maybe 7 or 8 months, but people started to say he was full of it because gradually he started acting more normal, or people would catch him acting more normal than they believe he tried to portray himself. Eventually, it became obvious. He could not keep up the charade any longer, and everyone knew he was faking being retarded. People started messing with him and tormenting him, people peeing on his laundry bag, trustees banging their brooms on the side of his cell wall to make him start going crazy and crying. He had a single cell in the corner. He was still trying to act like he was retarded, but was slipping up and slacking at times, and it became obvious he was full of it. The worst part is that he only got 4 years. 4 effing years for graping his daughter. I got 6 years for robbing someone of their drugs. Anyways, when he got to state prison after being shipped from the county jail, he got beat real freaking bad. Word travels in the system. I think he spent the remainder of his time in isolation. Even the guards hated him and knew he was BSing. Story 2. There's different degrees of evil. One of the smallest black guys in there was so loud and would not stop talking. He eventually freaked out and cut his body up with a razor blade to get medical attention for a different scene. Another guy was young, got beat by a 70-year-old in dominoes. The young guy just straight punched the old man in the forehead. I was reading Marley and Me, and it just sounded like someone hit a watermelon super hard. I looked up, an old man was knocked out on the floor. When he came to, the other 18-year-old kids were cracking up laughing, and the old man was so confused and kept asking, "Why are you laughing?" A white guy who was small and young was the Jack Russell Terrier of the pods, and he was the worst. He would just constantly steal, and for some reason nobody did anything about it. Guy named Nick looked just like Mike Tyson and would fight white people who would work out because they were doing it wrong. He would also stare at you while you were taking a dump. There was one corrections officer who assaulted me in a bathroom during work duty because I didn't know if a roll of toilet paper should be changed out. There was like a third left. It was my first day. He thought I was messing with him. After he hit me and was done, I said, "So, does it need to be changed? I still don't know." He figured out I was serious and apologized. One corrections officer always snuck me coffee and let me watch football on TV because I was nice and worked hard. That's the biggest problem with a thread like this. You can't really define a person as evil because there are a million different things people might do wrong, and it doesn't necessarily have anything to do with what the person does next. The guy who punched the old man might have never done anything like that again. It might have been an anger management thing that happened once. But some of the guys laughing at it might always think that sort of thing is funny. Talking about the worst thing you've seen a person do is one thing. Trying to guess at the most evil person you've met is impossible. Honestly, just look at some of the things people find funny on Reddit. There's probably never been a group of people less fit to judge good from evil than the ones who are chronically online. Story 3. Was in prison for 27 months. Unfortunately, your child rapists and kitty corn guys were mixed into general population, so you would get all kinds like that everywhere. The worst one I heard of was when I was in military prison. Details are foggy because this was 13 years ago, but I remember there being a guy who got 99 years for red rum. He had ended a guy's life, then ended the guy's wife's life because she was home and would have been a witness, but not before graping her first. The whole facility got locked down every time they moved this guy, because they didn't even want the other inmates to see what he looked like. The other messed up one was at the same facility. So in the Army, there's a thing called turtle fricking, where you hit someone's Kevlar helmet with your Kevlar helmet. It makes a loud thonk sound, but doesn't really hurt. People didn't hit super hard, just hard enough to make the noise happen. This guy turtle fricked a girl when she wasn't wearing a Kevlar helmet. She ended up not making it, while the guy was still awaiting his trial, and he went full-on cuckoo bananas. Story 4. I've not been in jail, so don't know if this will count. Please delete if not allowed. But when I was 19, I was a prison visitor. The one guy I visited was in jail for theft. He'd pick up high-value items and just walk out of a store. Think 10,000-pound electronics from Harrods, and did it repeatedly. I asked him why he did it so much, as he was not much older than me, and had been in and out of jail since he was about 15. His answer? He was attracted to young children, and wanted to make sure he could never act on those feelings. His doctor told him, he told me anyway, that it wasn't an issue because my friend told his doctor that he would never act on those feelings, and never got him any help he'd asked for. Now, I can guess what a lot of you are thinking. Yeah, right. But he told me about his own childhood, and every word was verified later on. But his parents had been abusing him for as long as he could remember, passing him around their disgusting friends to use as they wanted, along with other children at parties, etc. Just over a year of visiting him, and he hung himself, because he was going to be released, and he didn't want to be outside in case he did abuse some other children. He left a message saying he wanted to be sure he'd never hurt anyone the way he was. I miss him still, and was proud of him, and to call him my friend. Story 5. This rich kid stabbed his friend in the chest, ending his life, but he was on Xanax and weed at the time and doesn't remember anything of it, other than his friend on the floor passing away. The mad thing is, this guy, 18 years old, actually got off with the red rum and found not guilty, although he was sent down for just under 2 years for possession of a knife. His parents were quite wealthy, and it was a big case in the UK. Basically, his barristers were the best money could buy, and he said that's how he got off. Edit, he didn't have any remorse for his actions, which made him a pretty effed up person. It's a funny one, though, because he actually seemed like a nice guy, until he would talk about the incident and just didn't care about what he had done. Nobody else in the prison had ever ended someone's life, to my knowledge, and it was a lower cap prison, but he was only there for possession of a knife. Edit again, I didn't expect people to know the persons involved in this, or as many responses. I'm currently still on license, meaning I still have to report to the probation service, and don't particularly want any blowback for mentioning this, and can never be too careful. I'm not answering specifics on a public forum. I know it's anonymous, but just not worth the risk. This story comes up against something that always makes me scratch my head when we do the relationship stories. Doesn't at least a part of you worry that something you've said will be specific enough for someone to figure out who you are? Or do at least for them to make an educated guess that they just might happen to get right? It seems like sharing about specific cases that people have been to jail for would carry the same potential. And depending on their charge, some people on probation aren't supposed to use social media. But I get the feeling that didn't stop a number of them from posting on here. I'm starting to think this whole thread might have been posted by a prosecutor just to get some easy dirt together. Story 6. My dad went to prison for 6 months, and there's this one story that strikes me the most. A guy was convicted for graping someone. When he was asked who he did grape, he said it was just some escort. Later that day, when it was time for visiting, his wife went ballistic on him, screaming at him at the top of her lungs. Turns out he graped his 11-year-old stepdaughter. After the inmates and policemen found out, they took turns beating the crap out of him. I'm a corrections officer in a sizable county jail. I've worked on our protective custody pod a lot, and I've encountered some really gnarly people since then, including plenty of chomos. The worst, though, the one that actually shook me, was a dude about my age, mid-20s, tells me that he got busted for allegedly being part of a child trafficking ring, told me that the leader of the group would regularly force kids as young as 3 to blow him in front of folks at parties. I wanted to attack him. That situation was the one that made me start telling folks to shut up when they talk about their charges. I don't care about who you are or what you did. I don't want to hear about it, because if you did something terrible, it's going to affect my impartiality, Story 7. English guy here. I spent 4.5 months in prison in 2018. There was a guy who was really nice, seemed like a genuine guy. That was until I found out he strangled his drunk wife to death and left her there whilst he went to work the next morning. Ending your wife's life and going to work like nothing's wrong. Years ago, my husband trained a guy in his company, and the guy forgot their assigned iPad one day. He told him to go home and get it. The guy went home, stepped over his wife's lifeless body in the kitchen to grab his iPad, and returned back to work. About a week later, my husband came home and told me what they had found out when the police came in to ask them timeline questions and more right before he was arrested. He ended her life before work, hoping that his alibi would be, I was at work all day on base. I couldn't have done it. He made some critical mistakes. He would have been caught either way. But proof that he went home when her body was already laying there lifeless was another nail in the coffin for him. This is something a lot of people don't understand. Forensics is a madly specific science. They have any number of ways to figure out approximately when a person passed away. Hoping they'll opt for a broad time frame and that you'll get away with it because you have an alibi that almost sort of fits is not the best way to get off. First of all, it's amazing how much DNA evidence you've probably left behind without even being aware of it. Second, the timeline might be a lot more specific than you think. But most importantly, if they do believe you are at work, you'll still have to account for what might have happened, and they'll look deeper into that than you realize. So if his wife usually left for work as little as 10 minutes before he did, someone might inform the police of that, and the husband will be the prime suspect anyway. The best way to avoid getting caught is to simply not go around committing heinous crimes. Story 8. During my time in healthcare, there was a security officer that looked like a skinhead, but he was not. He was huge, like 6'5", around 370 pounds. Tattoos covered his body, but they were only just noticeable because he wore full-length shirts with collars. I got to know him and found out he was a retired correctional officer. He worked for more than 20 years. He shared some crazy stories. He talked of outright unbelievable stuff. But of all the things, this was one of the most horrendous inmates he spoke of. He was a corrections officer in Texas and was over the death row inmates. He said this one was there for kidnapping a mother and her 2 daughters. After raping them and ending their lives, he drove them out to the desert to drop their bodies off. One of the girls somehow survived and made it back to the road, where a trucker found her. I'm pretty sure they already executed this guy, and on the day of his execution, this security officer told the guy, "I'm going to go home and have a great meal thinking of your life ending." Story 9. When I was in jail, my cellie was a guy that tied his old lady down to their table and tried to carve "Do not resuscitate" into her chest. Halfway through, the cops showed up because the neighbors could hear her screaming. I tried as politely as I could to tell the captain that I don't mess around with woman beaters and asked for a block transfer. Thankfully, they put me in work release, which was awesome because I got to work in the kitchen and deliver food to the different blocks. No food hall meals were brought to you, and you never left your block except to go to the basketball court or the library. Well, one day I'm serving food to one of the solitary cells, and as soon as the slot is opened, a drenching wet magazine gets thrown out. Turns out it's covered in pee, and the woman inside is the chick my previously cellie carved up. Turns out she stabbed her son with a syringe of her blood, and she was inside too. Some crazy stories all around, but that couple far and away were the craziest people I saw. Story 10. I was with Christian Knighton in LA County Jail, 2 cells over from him. He was trying to get noticed and raised his hand to hit someone on the Southsiders bad news list. He stabbed his cellmate a gang of times in the neck and chest, ending his life. This was years back. He later became a Mexican mafia member, but dropped out because he himself ended up on their hit list. I wouldn't say he was the worst, though. LA County has a lot of crazy vatos, Bloods, Crips, Asian gangsters, you name it. Edit. Later, I ended up in a high desert state prison, one of the Hispanic groups called the Norteños, Northern Mexicans. It was very brutal how they remove their own people for getting out of line. They have a policy that they can't stop stabbing until the guards break it up, which can take forever. I watched them as they stabbed a guy dang near 60 times for using drugs. Massacred that dude. They have a policy of no drug use. That's not unique to this gang. A lot of prison gangs will ride their own members harder than they'll ride anyone else. If they're getting into fights with others, then a lot of times it'll be racially motivated, although there might be other causes. But a lot of them care more about how they're perceived than anything else. So if they think one of their members is making them look bad, things are about to get pretty rough for that guy. There are people who think the smart thing to do is join a gang for protection. But depending on who you're getting yourself involved with, going solo and keeping your head down might actually be a million times safer. Story 11. I wasn't an inmate, I was an officer, so my opinion might be disqualified, but at a facility I worked at, we were a level 5, which is maximum security. Lots of people who had life without parole, and just a bunch of different things happened. One guy was on a documentary because he traveled across several states and ended 5 people's lives in total. He was ticked off because the documentary blamed him, but he always tried to say his father hitting him as a child made him end these people's lives. Then there's the old guy who raped his young grandchildren and was furious that he was sent to prison because they were his grandkids, so he could do whatever he wanted. He had also raped his children when they were growing up. Lots of sick things in a max security prison, and those would be nothing when compared to a federal supermax. Story 12. Not in prison, but I was an intern in a public defender's office over 10 years ago, and the one that stands out was a juvenile locked up for the 3rd time for raping kids aged 2 to 4. Kid was obese and clearly very damaged. This was a juvenile detention center that was often used as a babysitter by crackhead moms, accusing the kid of a crime and getting them locked up for the weekend so they could go on a bender. He was serving a sentence. I was warned going in there that he could turn violent at the drop of a hat, and the attorney was nervous about bringing a young female in, but I insisted. Kid looks me straight in the eye and says, "Don't let me out. I will do it again. I can't stop." He was hunched over, dead eyes, and completely serious. Story 13. I know this doesn't fit the question 100%, but I'll chip in. I was a juror, never been in jail/prison, on a high-profile red rum case a couple years ago. The man was charged with conspiracy to commit red rum. We found him not guilty, long story, as it was his girlfriend that actually committed the crime. This wasn't just any typical red rum, though. This guy's girlfriend faked a pregnancy, and when it was time to deliver, she lured a pregnant neighbor girl over to her apartment, ended her life, and cut the baby out, intending to raise it as their own. The state got the woman to testify against her boyfriend at the trial, so I can probably say that was the only time I've ever been in the same room as someone that is evil. The scariest thing about this story is just the fact that it was the prosecution's idea to pin everything on the man instead of the woman who did it. To be fair, there could be a lot of details missing here. Maybe they were in on it together, and the state assumed the jury would be more likely to convict a man. Maybe the woman told the prosecution a story that they believed. But this is one of the reasons that trying to cut deals to get people to testify against each other can backfire. It's along the lines of what they call prisoner's dilemma. The question of whether you should testify against a co-conspirator or if it might backfire. But this story shows that it can backfire against the prosecution as well. If they had even the slightest idea that she was guilty, they should have been pursuing that. Story 14. Hands down. So this lady was married, husband cheated, had a full-blown affair, ended up with a love child. Somewhere along the line, the wife is babysitting the husband's illegitimate child. He comes home from work, sitting down to eat dinner, and asks her, "How's the baby?" She says, "I don't know, you tell me." This chick ended up ending the baby's life, cooking it, putting it in the food, and fed it to him. She's doing 2 life sentences. This is in Arizona, by the way. Side note, she looks like the devil. Her eyes are literally black, and she looks like she has no soul. It takes a lot to creep me out, but this lady's vibe is one of the darkest things I've ever felt in my entire life. Story 15. Heard a story that some inmates would put broken glass in their feces and throw it at correctional officers' faces. So when they would wipe the stuff away from their eyes, the glass cuts them. Yup, they mix it with urine as well as to make it a fine mist. Often it will be allowed to ferment for an extended period of time to make it as putrid as possible. It's called gassing, and it's become such a problem in American prisons that they made it a felony. Edit. Wow, one of my highest upvoted comments is about throwing pee and crap at people. What a time to be alive. Story 16. There was a correctional officer, at least 6'5" and well-built, and he would always come in ticked off. So one morning, we're waiting in line for breakfast, and he thought he heard this older man call him a B word. He followed the man back to his cell and started teeing off on him. The man didn't even try fighting back, and when he fell the first time, he split his head open on the steel bunk. The inmate was so out of it, he started asking where his car keys and wallet went when he was on the ground bleeding. The corrections officer hears the man and, for some reason, turns around and goes back and hits him a few more times and says, "Who's the B word now?" I'll never forget thinking, dang, this is somebody's father. It's somebody's father, somebody's son, somebody's brother. It's weird that we need context to feel compassion for a person, but I can promise you there are people who won't feel any whatsoever. When someone's in jail, it's easy for most people to write them off as potentially deserving whatever comes to them. The irony is that the reason certain behaviors are crimes is because we decided as a society that nobody deserves for those things to happen to them. So that line of thinking definitely doesn't excuse the guard, nor would it excuse anybody else. Some of these stories have been celebrating cops mistreating prisoners, but that's definitely the wrong way to look at it. And especially in a society that seems increasingly interested in holding law enforcement accountable, we can't just pick and choose when that ought to happen. Story 17. I was in a woman's prison, and a new inmate told everyone she was in for tax fraud. A couple of days later, she gets the crap beaten out of her and doesn't leave her cell again. Food gets taken in by screws, and eventually she gets ghosted out. Turns out she was in our side, and both her husband and son were in the male side for running a child trafficking ring. Those guys had been put straight into the VP wing, but most female prisoners don't have enough offenders to have one. It was one of the screws who told some of the inmates why she was in. They wanted her to be taught a lesson. The offenses were awful. She was fully part of it and was responsible for acquiring a lot of the victims, as she was trusted by people. Youngest victim was her niece's 3-month-old, who had to be hospitalized due to trauma. Story 18. I had a cellie in prison who was a KKK white boy. He was a madman. He was always ticked off and would say the craziest stuff, like, "Did you hear that? The white rhino is going extinct. Effing Jews." I was watching a movie about black pilots in World War II, and he sat down indignant and rolled his eyes and guffawed. "Black pilots? Come on." I said, "You really think there are no black pilots?" He said, "Heck no. Have you ever seen a black pilot?" It was like this every day until my move finally got approved. Story 19. I was incarcerated with over 280 people doing life without parole. There were all kinds. Stabbed a neighbor lady 150 plus times, shot a bully in the head in the school parking lot, beat a dude with a hammer, etc. There were 2 that stuck with me though. One where he looked me right in the eye and told me about shooting a guy with a shotgun to the chest. Creeped me the F out. Weirdo that kidnapped and ended some girl's life in his basement was another. John Wayne Gacy actually designed the miniature golf course there. Story 20. I'm 20 and was in and out of juvie from 15 to 18 till I went to county jail. The worst person I came into contact with was a boy of 15 who shot his stepmother, slit her throat, beat her head in with a blunt object, and wrapped her in sheets for the father's roommate to find her. Then he shot him. Happened in McMinnville, Oregon. Other than that, a lot of people graping siblings and making threats to shoot up the high schools in the area. That's Yamhill country for you. The worst part of stories like this one is that they make you wonder how the kid's future might have been different. For a crime like that, most kids are getting tried as adults. You don't get a slap on the wrist for something that horrific. It's a little ambiguous in the story as written, since it's not clear if this was one of the guys he met in juvie or when he went to county later on. If he was being tried as an adult, he probably would have been in county. But even kids who go to juvie usually wind up in county at one point or another. And you always have to wonder if there were mental disorders or substance use issues that led to what they did. Because if so, it seems like there may have been a point in their lives when a little bit of intervention could have kept them off the path that ultimately took away their freedom. This is why it shouldn't be that hard to have some compassion for inmates. We never know how the lives they're living now might have been avoided. Story 21. My friend's dad was a volunteer chaplain, taking care of prisoners' religious needs at the county jail. He came into our criminal justice class to talk about working at a jail. He told us that the most evil people at a jail are the ones that show no remorse for their actions. He saw the guy that ended the life of a foreign exchange student that attended the University of Utah, and he told us that the guy didn't seem to care at all. He was calm about everything. Story 22. Worked at a jail. A pregnant detainee didn't like one of her kids' baby daddies, and so she abused the child, beating him with her boyfriend's cable wires, starving the kid, and making him live in a closet in his own feces. Acted perfectly normal and agreeable, didn't abuse the other kids, allegedly. Evil mother. Hope she never sees another child in her entire life. Hope the little boy is loved now. Story 23. I was never in prison, but I worked in a jail. The most notable inmate there was Jonathan Lawrence. Him and his best friend, Jeremiah Rogers, lured a girl into the woods and ended her life in cold blood. When police were searching for his home, they found her calf in his freezer that he was saving to eat. He was sentenced to death. Story 24. I was 16 but tried as an adult, so they kept me in a 21 and under pod. Malvo, the DC sniper, was in my pod. Also, one of the first people I saw in a chain gang was Charles Manson's brother. Swastika on his forehead and everything. Lesson learned, don't be a frick boy. Story 25. I did 5 years in Leicester and Featherstone prisons in the early 80s. One guy in Featherstone was a lifer and had done 30 plus years. Apparently, he used to bang young boys and cut their dongs off. When he was arrested, he had a fresh dong in his pocket. I know this is entirely the wrong question to ask, but when I hear stories about this kind of off-the-wall, 100% crazy type of crime, I always wonder what part of it seemed rational in the mind of the person committing it. Because there has to be something, right? Does a person walk around with that particular piece of anatomy in their pocket if they don't have some idea of what they plan on doing with it later? I know some people will tell you that there really are a few out there who are just plain crazy, and that's the end of it. I just don't know if it is. I usually compare it to being blacked out. You might do some pretty crazy things when you're blacked out, but at the time you did them, you had some reason for thinking they were okay. With guys like this, who I assume must be suffering from some kind of mental disorder, I always wonder what that twisted reasoning must look like. Story 26. One of the women on my wing cut up her lover and put his body parts in an empty TV box, then put the TV box on his mother's doorstep. I used to let her thread my eyebrows every fortnight until I found out what she was in for. Story 27. Before I got my prison sentence in 2013, I was in Arapahoe County Jail with James Holmes. Was pretty crazy because they'd put the whole facility on lockdown to move him, even though he was in segregation. Story 28. I was locked up with Jodi Arias, so that was bizarre. There was also a woman who red-rummed her baby and kept it in the freezer. We called her Maytag. Story 29. My mom was locked up with Selena's red rummer, and we all knew what she did. Every Mexican woman wanted to end her life, so they kept her away from everyone. Story 30. The words, "I shot that bee in the stomach, and I hope neither of them survive," were used in reference to a 15-year-old pregnant girl. I won't be able to forget that one. It's so insane reading this in such close proximity to the woman who put her baby in the freezer. The guy with the gun is remembered as cold and hardened. The other one gets a weirdly cute nickname like Maytag. But one thing that can really be weird about correctional institutions is that people with similar crimes can sometimes be treated completely differently from one another. Like anybody else in the world, inmates and guards play favorites with each other. Someone might do terrible things and get largely ignored because they have a favorable personality with the right people to keep themselves safe. That may not sound much like justice, but it's at least one way in that, if we're being honest, correctional facilities work pretty much the same way as the rest of the world. There are certainly differences, but the lack of perceived fairness or consistency among those with similar backgrounds definitely isn't one of them. Please leave your stories in the comments. I'd love to make a video of them in the future. Also, don't forget to like and subscribe.